She wiped barbecue sauce off his cheek with her thumb. Slow, deliberate, unbothered by the 50 people watching. And when he laughed it off with, "People are going to think we're dating," she didn't laugh back. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I hope they do." And just like that, every assumption Landon Hayes had ever made about his life, his loneliness, and the woman living 3 houses down came crashing down around him like a wall he didn't know he'd built. This is the story of a man who almost missed the best thing that ever happened to him, and the woman who quietly waited while he figured it out. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and if it moves you, hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't want to leave early on this one. The morning of the Maplewood Neighborhood Charity Barbecue began the way most August Saturdays began in that particular pocket of suburban Ohio, with humidity that pressed against your skin before you even stepped outside, the smell of cut grass drifting up from somewhere down the block, and the distant sound of a lawnmower that someone had already given up on halfway through the job. Landon Hayes was awake at 6:15, not because he wanted to be, not because he was some eager sunrise-chasing type of man. He was awake because his 7-year-old daughter, Maya, had crawled into his bed sometime around 5:30, decided his pillow was better than hers, stolen it without ceremony, and left him staring at the ceiling with nothing between his head and the mattress but his own forearm. He lay there for a while, listening to her breathe. She slept the way kids sleep when they don't have anything to worry about yet, completely, fully, like sleep was a place she'd gone on vacation. He watched the ceiling fan rotate, counted the rotations, thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you do when you're tired but can't get back under. Then Maya shifted, tucked her knees to her chest, and murmured something that sounded like "not the blue one," apparently negotiating with someone in her dream, and Landon felt the corner of his mouth pull without meaning to. He got up. The kitchen was quiet in the way that only kitchens are quiet at 6 in the morning, that particular stillness where even the refrigerator hum feels respectful. He made coffee with the focus of a man performing a small ritual, measured out the grounds, waited for the machine to do its work, and stood at the counter looking out the window at the backyard where the grass needed cutting and the old lawn chair near the fence had been sitting slightly crooked since April, and he still hadn't fixed it. He'd get to it. He always told himself that. By 7, he had a list, not written down. Landon rarely wrote anything down. It lived in his head in the organized, slightly anxious way that single parents store information. The charcoal needed to be in the truck by 8:30. The grill grates needed a scrub before setup. He needed to remember to grab the tongs from the second drawer because the first drawer's tongs had a handle that had been wobbling for 6 months, and he'd almost lost a burger to the coals 3 times because of it. He was the grill guy. Had been for 3 years running. Not because anyone had officially appointed him. The barbecue had no official anything, that was sort of the point, but because the first year he'd shown up with his own equipment and quietly taken over the setup without making a fuss about it, and the year after that people had simply assumed he'd do it again, and by year 3 it had become the kind of thing that happens in neighborhoods before anyone realizes it. Landon Hayes runs the grill. He didn't mind. Honestly, he liked it. There was something about standing behind a grill, managing the heat, watching the char lines form on chicken thighs, having a clear and simple job. It gave him somewhere to put his hands, a purpose with a visible result. In a life that sometimes felt like he was navigating by feel in a dark room, the barbecue grill was one of the few things that made sense in a straightforward way. Maplewood Drive was not a rich street. It was not a poor street either. It existed in that particular American middle ground of well-kept modest homes, mature trees whose roots had started quietly destroying the sidewalks, basketball hoops at the ends of driveways, and the occasional car that someone had been meaning to sell for 2 years but couldn't bring themselves to actually list. The neighborhood had character. That was what people said. What they meant was that it had history, families who had been there long enough to know each other's business without asking, long enough to recognize which dog belonged to which house by bark alone, long enough to hold grudges about property lines and simultaneously bring each other soup during flu season. Vivian Sterling had moved to Maplewood Drive 26 months ago. Nobody had known who she was. That was almost certainly the point. She had arrived on a Tuesday, which was already notable because people don't move on Tuesdays. They move on weekends like normal people, driving a vehicle that was expensive but not flashy, a dark gray SUV without custom plates or any of the markers that typically announce money before money speaks for itself. She had 2 movers and a modest number of boxes, and when Patrice Okafor from number 14 had walked over to introduce herself and immediately asked, in Patrice's very direct way, "What do you do, hun?" Vivian had smiled and said she worked in finance, which was true. It was also the kind of answer designed to end a conversation without lying. What Vivian Sterling actually did was run a private equity firm with 31 employees, a portfolio valued at several $100 million, and a reputation in financial circles that made certain people in certain rooms go very quiet when her name came up. She had built the firm from a series of early decisions that people, in retrospect, called genius, and that she described, if pressed, as just being less afraid of being wrong than other people were. She was 30 years old. She had more money than she could reasonably spend in 3 lifetimes. And she had chosen to live on Maplewood Drive in a 3-bedroom house with an overgrown rose bush along the front fence and a kitchen that needed new cabinet handles. Nobody on Maplewood Drive knew about the money, not in the beginning. They found out gradually, the way neighborhoods find things out, sideways, through overheard phone conversations and curious Googling, and the time Marcus Webb's teenage son had recognized her name from a financial news segment and had said, loudly, at the 4th of July block party, "Wait, are you that Vivian Sterling?" And Vivian had looked at him steadily and said, "I'm the one who lives on this street." Yeah. Which was, somehow, the exact right answer. Because here was the thing about Vivian Sterling that made no sense to anyone who knew her net worth and also knew her. She was not what that number should produce. She was the person who showed up at community meetings and actually stayed for the whole thing. She was the one who remembered that old Mr. Delgado at the end of the block took his trash out on Thursdays, but had bad knees, so she quietly started rolling his bins back in on Friday mornings. She was the one who organized the Maplewood Winter Coat Drive 2 years running without putting her name anywhere on the flyers. She was also the one who, at the previous year's barbecue, had spent 45 minutes helping a 4-year-old named Ellie reconstruct a sandcastle that had been accidentally stepped on, taking the task with the same focused seriousness she likely brought to board meetings. Maplewood Drive, collectively, had decided Vivian Sterling was one of them. The number in her bank account was someone else's problem. The woman at the Rosebush house was theirs. Landon had the grill going by 9:15. Setup had taken longer than expected because the folding table he'd borrowed from the community shed had a leg that needed coaxing, and coaxing it had required a specific vocabulary of words he did not say out loud because Maya was sitting on the grass 6 feet away, arranging a line of small rocks into what she informed him was a ferry road. "A ferry road," he'd repeated. "They need to know where to go, Dad." She'd said it like it was obvious, like he was the one not tracking. He'd gotten the table sorted, set up the grill, got the coals lit with the patience that came from doing it enough times to stop rushing. While the coals worked their way to ready, he walked the perimeter of the setup area. They used the large flat section of Riverside Park, 3 blocks from the street, checking that the folding chairs were arranged at the right distance from the heat, that the coolers were in the shade, that the condiments table wasn't going to wobble. Neighbors started arriving around 10. The Okafor family with their enormous contribution of potato salad. Patrice made it in a bowl that appeared to have been designed for mixing cement. Marcus Webb brought his speaker and set it up with the confidence of a man who had definite opinions about outdoor event music. The Delgado grandchildren arrived in a pack, running immediately to the playground equipment at the far end of the park. By 10:30, the barbecue was alive. Landon was in his element. There's a particular kind of social comfort that comes from having a task, a reason to be somewhere that doesn't require working the room or remembering to maintain conversation. He worked the grill with an easy rhythm, rotating pieces, managing the heat, responding to orders that people placed with the casual familiarity of a food truck line. "Can you do mine medium? Do you have any without sauce?" "My daughter doesn't eat dark meat." He accommodated all of it without resentment, because this was the agreement, and the agreement suited him. He was not, by nature, a room worker. Small talk required effort in a way that the grill did not. He was in the middle of a fairly precise negotiation between 2 racks of ribs and a batch of corn on the cob. When he heard Maya somewhere behind him go, Vivian, look at my ferry road," he turned on reflex. Vivian Sterling was crouching down to examine Maya's rock arrangements with the genuine attention of someone who had not been handed a child to look at and was therefore performing interest. She was actually looking. Her head was tilted. She was asking questions. From across the distance, Landon couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could see Maya responding with escalating enthusiasm, pointing to various sections of the road with explanatory gestures. Vivian was wearing a plain white linen shirt, the kind that looked simple and probably wasn't. Dark jeans rolled at the ankle, and her hair was pulled back in the loose, slightly imprecise way that suggested she hadn't spent much time in front of a mirror. She looked, as she usually looked, like someone who was simply and completely comfortable wherever she happened to be. Landon watched for a few seconds longer than he should have, then turned back to the grill. He'd known Vivian for 2 years. 2 years of that particular neighborly proximity that produces its own specific kind of relationship. Not quite friendship in the way that word usually works, but something more than acquaintance. Something that had happened gradually, almost accidentally, the way most things in life happen if you're not paying attention. It had started practically. She had noticed 6 weeks after she moved in that he was operating alone. Not in a pitying way. Vivian didn't seem to have that particular gear, but in the observant way of someone who noticed patterns. He had a daughter and no partner. He worked what appeared to be long hours at the auto parts distribution company where he managed logistics, and there were specific days, she told him this much later, where he looked like a man carrying something heavy up a staircase with no railing and no destination in sight. She'd started small. A casserole left on his porch with a note that just said, Vivian. 3 houses down, blue door when Maya had been sick with a fever that coincided with a delivery crisis at work. A text a few months later asking if Maya could tag along on a park run since she was going anyway. A conversation over the back fence one night when he'd been sitting outside after Maya was in bed, too tired to go inside and too wound up to sleep, and Vivian had come out to her own yard and they had actually talked, not the 2-sentence neighbor version, for over an hour. He had thought of her as a friend, a good one. One of those people who arrive in your life quietly enough that by the time you've understood the shape of what they mean to you, they've already been there for years. He had not consciously anyway, thought of her as anything else. The barbecue peaked around noon. The food had long crossed over from adequate to abundant. Someone had contributed a cooler of popsicles that the children had discovered with the enthusiasm of a gold rush. And there was a loose argument happening near the beverage table about whether the playlist should shift from classic R&B to country, an argument that Marcus Webb was losing slowly but refusing to accept. Landon was working the grill with his sleeves pushed up, sweating in the clean way of someone doing physical work on a hot day, focused on a fresh rack of ribs he'd been managing for the last 30 minutes. He had sauce. He was applying it with a brush in the methodical, experienced way of someone who had opinions about how barbecue sauce behaved under heat. He was leaning over the grill, concentrating, when he misjudged the angle. The brush caught the edge of the rack and redirected, not catastrophically, not a disaster by any measure, but enough. A thick streak of barbecue sauce traced a line across his left cheek, almost reaching the corner of his mouth. He became aware of it approximately 1 second later, when the man beside him, Carl, who was married to Patrice and thought he was funnier than he was, said, "Hayes, you got a little," and made a circular gesture at his own face. "I see it," Landon said, setting down the brush and reaching for the rag tucked in his belt. He didn't see Vivian approach. She was simply there, as she had a way of being, appearing without announcement or ceremony. She was holding a cup of lemonade and she stopped in front of him, looked at his face, and without anything resembling hesitation or negotiation, reached up with her free hand, her thumb, and wiped the sauce from his cheek in one clean, unhurried motion. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt longer. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Because it was the complete absence of drama that made it what it was. The ease of it, the naturalness, the way she did it, the way you touch someone when their presence is familiar enough that the barrier between you and them has quietly, without announcement, dissolved. She looked at her thumb, made a brief expression of mild distaste at the sauce on it, and glanced back up at him. Landon was aware that Carl was watching. He was aware, with the particular peripheral social awareness of someone who does not love being the center of attention, that several other people nearby had witnessed the exchange. He did what he typically did when he didn't know what else to do. He made a joke. "People are going to think we're dating," he said. Lightly, easy, the tone of someone deflecting. He waited for her to laugh. Vivian Sterling looked at him for a moment. Not a long moment, just a moment, long enough to be a choice. "I hope they do," she said. Then she took a sip of her lemonade, turned, and walked back toward the gathering like she hadn't just said anything at all. Carl said, "Huh." Landon said nothing. He picked up the brush. He looked at the ribs. He applied sauce with slightly less precision than usual because approximately 40% of his brain had stopped cooperating with his hands. "I hope they do." He replayed it, checked it for irony, for the particular dry humor that Vivian occasionally deployed in a way that required a second to recognize. There was none. He checked it for ambiguity, for the possibility that he had heard it wrong or that it meant something other than what it sounded like. He found none of that either. She had meant it. He had no training in Vivian Sterling saying things she didn't mean. In 2 years, he couldn't think of a single example. "I hope they do." Carl had moved on. The barbecue continued its full, sprawling Saturday momentum around him. Children running, music shifting, Marcus had apparently lost the argument, smoke drifting, the comfortable noise of people who liked each other and chose, once a year at minimum, to prove it collectively. Landon stood behind his grill and did his job and tried not to look across the park to where Vivian was now sitting with 3 other women on a blanket in the shade, laughing at something, her knees pulled up, entirely unbothered. He looked anyway, twice, maybe 3 times. Maya appeared at his elbow. "Dad, can I have a popsicle?" "How many have you had?" "2, but the second one was small." "That's a no, Bug." She groaned with the performative suffering of a child who has lost a negotiation but hasn't accepted it yet. "What if I also eat some of the watermelon?" "Then you can have a popsicle after the watermelon." She disappeared. He turned back to the grill. He thought about Vivian wiping the sauce from his cheek, the way her thumb had just moved. No preamble. No here, let me, just done. Like she'd done it before in her head enough times that the first time was already comfortable. "Stop it," he told himself. He managed the ribs, distributed plates, accepted compliments about the chicken thighs with appropriate modesty, helped carry coolers when it was time to pack up, loaded his truck, drove home through the late afternoon light with Maya in the back seat talking about the ferry road and the popsicle and whether ferries were nocturnal, and he answered her questions and drove and felt, underneath all of it, the persistent low hum of something he couldn't name. Maya was asleep by 8:45. She'd fought it. She always fought it. Sleep was surrender, and Maya Hayes did not surrender without a minimum of 2 requests for water. One claimed that her leg hurt in a vague and non-locatable way, and a final negotiation for just 5 more minutes that she stated with the earnestness of someone making a legal argument. He had sat on the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed, until the negotiations ended mid-sentence, until she was fully and completely gone. He stood in the doorway for a moment after, just looking at her. She had her mother's nose. Landon didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that, but sometimes it was simply there, undeniable. The particular curve of it in sleep, the way it made her look like someone else's child and entirely his own simultaneously. Maya's mother, Claire, had left when Maya was 14 months old. Not dramatically, not with a fight. She had sat down one night and told him, with a honesty that he had come to reluctantly respect over the years, that she was not built for the life they were building, that she loved Maya in a way that was real but insufficient, that staying would make her into someone who resented the 2 people she loved most. She sent birthday cards. She called on holidays. She was not a villain in the story. She was just absent, in the quiet, daily, bone-deep way that absence accumulates. Landon had built something anyway, built it out of routine and stubbornness and the occasional grace of people like Vivian, who showed up without being asked. He went downstairs, poured a glass of water, sat on the back porch in the dark, in the crooked lawn chair that still needed fixing, and looked at the stars that were visible between cloud cover. "I hope they do." He sat with it in the quiet. The first thing he thought, and then tried not to think, was how long. How long had she meant it? because the way she'd said it, that calm, unembellished certainty, didn't sound like something new. It sounded like something that had been true for a while and had simply been waiting for the right moment to step out into the open. He started slowly to rewind. He went back to the casserole. The first one, the night Maya had a fever of 102, and he was fielding calls from his supervisor about a shipment that had gotten held at the wrong distribution center, and he'd been pacing the kitchen trying to manage both things at once when he found the dish on his porch with the note. He'd thought, at the time, new neighbor being kind, that's a good sign for the block. He went back to the park runs. The way Vivian had never made it feel like charity, she had presented it as practical. I'm going anyway, as though taking Maya along was a convenience for her rather than a service for him. She'd done that, he realized now, with most things. Framed help in a way that removed the debt of it. He went back to the fence conversation. That November night, wind picking up, the yard smelling like leaves and cold air. He'd been sitting outside in a jacket that wasn't warm enough because the inside of the house had felt like a container that night, too small, too full of the evidence of everything he was managing alone. She had come out to her own yard, and he'd heard her, and she'd heard him, and there had been a brief negotiation of the darkness before she said simply, "Rough night." And he had said, "Yeah." And then, for reasons he still couldn't fully explain, he had said, "I just get tired sometimes," which was the most honest thing he'd said to another adult in months. And she had said, sitting on her side of the fence, not trying to fix it or reframe it or point toward the bright side, "I know. I watch you, and you do a lot. It's okay to be tired." He had sat there for another hour and talked, and when he went inside, he'd felt lighter in a way that hadn't come from solving anything, just from being heard by someone who didn't need anything from him in exchange. He sat on the back porch now, in the dark, turning these moments over, looking at them from the new angle her words had created. Every single one of them looked different, not manufactured, not performed, just more. More than what he'd filed them as. More than neighbor, more than friend, more than the casual benevolence of someone with resources choosing to distribute them locally. She had been there. For 2 years, she had simply been there, in the particular, consistent way of someone who has made a quiet decision and is acting on it every single day without announcement. He felt something loosen in his chest. It was not entirely comfortable. It was the feeling of something that had been held carefully in place beginning to move. He thought about Vivian's face when she'd said it, the complete stillness of it. Not nervous, not performing boldness, just true. I hope they do. The yard was quiet around him. The fence between their yards was 20 feet away. Her lights were off. She'd been home for at least an hour. He sat there for a long time, staring at the dark space between his yard and hers. He went inside, washed the glass, stood at the kitchen sink for a minute looking at nothing. Here was what he knew about himself, and had known for a long time without particularly enjoying the knowing. He was not good at this. Not at the opening part, the risk part. The part where you take something that exists in private and expose it to the possibility of being wrong. He had been 24 when he and Claire got together, and that had moved in the young, fast, certain way of things that happen before you know enough to be cautious. He had not since then learned to do the cautious version. He had dated, twice, in 7 years. Both times briefly, both times with the uncomfortable awareness that Maya was watching from a careful distance, registering everything, already at the age where she understood more than she articulated. He had ended both situations before they required anything too real, and he told himself it was for her, and it was also, honestly, for him. For the part of him that found the early vulnerability of it genuinely hard. Vivian was not early. That was what stopped him at the kitchen sink, staring at the faucet. Vivian was 2 years in. She was already woven through his daily life in ways he hadn't mapped until tonight. She was in the stories Maya told, in the fabric of his weekends, in his first call mental list when something went sideways. She was not a risk the way an early thing was a risk. She was a risk the way things that matter are risks. That's worse, some part of him said. The rest of him was quiet for a moment and then said slowly, "Yeah, but she already said it first." He went to bed. He slept poorly. He kept replaying her face, that calm, unflinching delivery, and the ease of her thumb on his cheek, and the way she had walked away afterward like the most important thing she'd said all year deserved no more ceremony than that. Somewhere in the early hours, he made a decision. He was up before Maya again. The lawn chair on the back porch still sat slightly crooked, same as it always had, and the morning light was the particular pale gold of early August that made everything look like a photograph of itself. He made coffee. He thought about what he was going to say. He didn't have a speech. Landon Hayes was not a speech person. He was a direct question, plain language, see what happens person, when he could manage to be brave enough for any of those. What he had was the decision he'd made in the dark, which was he was going to go over there. He was going to say something honest, and whatever happened after that would happen. He heard Maya's feet on the stairs at 7:20. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair in the state it was always in after sleep. A situation that had evolved overnight from the pigtails he'd given her the night before into something that looked like a creative experiment. She was wearing the t-shirt she'd had on yesterday, which she must have put back on because she could not find the pajamas he'd set out, and she was squinting slightly against the morning light. "Why are you dressed?" she said. "Because it's morning. It's early morning. Still morning." She considered this. Then she climbed onto the kitchen stool and regarded him with the particular evaluating look she'd had since she was about 4, the one that assessed whether something was normal or whether something was different. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. He put cereal on the counter. "Yeah, Bug, I'm okay." She poured her own cereal with concentration. He watched her for a moment, this small person who had required everything from him for 7 years and given back, in completely disproportionate return, the feeling that his life had a center. He thought about Vivian sitting in the grass with Maya, examining ferry roads. The ease of it. How long it had been easy. How did I not see it, he thought. Not with self-recrimination, more with the slow, genuine wonder of someone who has just found something that was in plain sight the whole time. "Dad." "Yeah." "You're staring." "Sorry." Maya pointed her spoon at him. "You have a weird look on your face." "I'm fine." She studied him one more second, decided she accepted this, and returned to her cereal. He poured his coffee. He stood at the counter. He thought about what it meant to know someone the way he knew Vivian, imperfectly, practically, through the unglamorous daily accumulation of 2 years of proximity and realness, and then about what it might mean to want to know her differently. The morning opened up slowly around him. He had a feeling, sitting somewhere behind his ribs, that was not quite excitement and not quite fear. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something significant, knowing there was no good way to approach it except directly. He would go over in the morning. He'd knock on her door. Whatever happened after that, well, he'd figure it out. He always did. He didn't go over that morning. He had every intention of going. He had the decision made. He had the coffee in his hand. He had the particular forward momentum of a man who had spent the night working himself up to something and arrived at the morning ready to do it. And then Maya had asked around 7:45 if they could make pancakes, not regular pancakes, the ones with the blueberries mixed in, the ones that required finding the specific pan that was in the back of the cabinet behind the Dutch oven. And he had said yes, and by the time they were done making them and eating them and cleaning up the pan and mediating a brief conflict between Maya and a piece of blueberry that had ended up somewhere on her shirt, it was 9:15, and the morning had shifted into the practical, moving territory of a Saturday with a 7-year-old, and the original momentum had quietly bled out. He told himself he'd go in the afternoon. In the afternoon, Maya wanted to ride her bike, and the chain needed adjusting, and then one of the neighborhood kids, a boy named Theo, who lived 4 houses down and was Maya's current best friend and frequent co-conspirator, showed up at the door asking if she could come out, and Landon had spent 2 hours on the front porch watching them ride in loose, looping circles on the sidewalk while he sat with a lukewarm second coffee and talked himself in and out of the same conversation approximately 40 times. The problem was not that he didn't know what he wanted to say. The problem was that every version of it, when he ran it through his head, arrived at the same exposed place, the place where he had said the real thing and was now waiting for her response. And in that waiting was every possible way it could be wrong. Not wrong like she'd laugh at him. Not that kind of wrong. Wrong like, maybe he had misread. Maybe I hope they do had a meaning he'd invented. Maybe Vivian Sterling, who was 30 years old and worth more money than he would see in several lifetimes and could have anyone she chose, had meant something casual, and he was sitting on his porch constructing a narrative out of a single sentence and a thumb on his cheek. That was the version that kept stopping him. He went inside when the kids came in for dinner. He made something simple: pasta, jarred sauce, the kind of meal that required zero creativity and existed only to solve the practical problem of food. And he sat across from Maya while she told him about Theo's new video game and the argument they'd had about whether the dragon in it was blue or purple. And he listened and responded and was, for all visible purposes, completely present. Inside, he was elsewhere. By the time Maya was in bed that night, he had made the decision again. Tomorrow. He would go tomorrow, in the morning, before he had time to talk himself out of it. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Vivian, and then he did something he hadn't done in a while. He started actually remembering. Not the way you remember things when you're cataloging them for evidence, the way he'd done the night before, running moments through the new filter of what she'd said. This time he just let them come. Let them arrive in the order they wanted, without sorting them into arguments. The morning she'd texted him, randomly, a photo of a gas station sign that said "Fresh Hot Dogs," proudly made since 1987 with no caption, and he'd laughed out loud in his office and texted back, "This is what you wanted me to see today," and she'd responded, "I thought you needed it," and she had been right, he had. It had been a genuinely bad Thursday, and that photo had been the only thing that had made him laugh all day. The afternoon she'd picked Maya up from school when his car wouldn't start and he'd called in a quiet panic, and she'd said, "I've got it. Go deal with the car," in that matter-of-fact way she had. And when he'd finally gotten home, she and Maya were on the living room floor doing a puzzle together, and Vivian had looked up and said she told me about the Ferry Road situation. I think we've identified an expansion opportunity, and Maya had said the South End needs more courts very seriously, and he had stood in his own doorway, feeling something warm and unnameable move through him. The night last December when he'd been wrapping Christmas presents after midnight and had run out of tape and had texted her on impulse. They texted sometimes about practical things, about the neighborhood, about whether the new family on the corner had a dog, or just a very enthusiastic house guest. And she had texted back 30 seconds later, "I have tape, back doors unlocked," like it was the most natural thing in the world. And he had walked through the cold to her house at 12:30 in the morning, and she'd been in her kitchen in sweats and reading glasses she never wore in public, a mug of something steaming on the counter, and she had handed him the tape without ceremony and said, "Do you want tea?" And he'd said, "It's midnight," and she'd said, "That's not a no," and he had stayed for 45 minutes because the conversation had gone somewhere, and he hadn't wanted to leave it. He lay there in the dark, and each memory arrived a little heavier than the one before it, carrying the new weight of what he now understood. Not romantic weight in the performed sense, not the polished version of feelings that people described in terms that sounded like song lyrics. Real weight. The kind that came from accumulated time and genuine knowledge of a person. The weight of, she knew how he took his coffee. She knew that he got quiet when he was overwhelmed rather than loud about it. And she had learned to ask specific questions rather than general ones, because general ones let him deflect. She knew he was more sentimental about Maya than he admitted, and less sentimental about himself than was probably healthy. He knew things about her too. He knew she was an early riser who described herself as a night owl, because she stayed up late thinking, but regretted it every morning. He knew she was funnier than most people got to see because the humor came sideways and quietly, and you had to be paying attention. He knew she was harder on herself than she was on anyone else. He knew she had a thing about the rose bush at the front of her house that she would never fully explain. She tended it with a specific care that suggested it mattered in a way that went beyond aesthetics, but whenever he'd asked, she'd said only that it was complicated and changed the subject. He knew her the way you know someone when you've been paying attention to them for 2 years without admitting you were paying that kind of attention. The ceiling was the same ceiling it always was. The house was quiet. Outside, the late summer night was warm and still. She said it first, he thought again. She stood there in front of 40 people with barbecue sauce on her thumb, and she said it like it was nothing because for her it apparently was nothing. It was already settled. It was already decided, and she was just saying it. He thought about what kind of person did that, who carried something for what might have been a long time, and then, when the moment arrived sideways and accidental, just told the truth about it. Not with drama, not with build-up. Just calmly, factually, the way Vivian did most things. It made him feel, lying there, a particular kind of shame that had nothing to do with anything bad. The shame of she had been braver than him for a long time, possibly a much longer time than he'd understood. He slept eventually. Not well, but enough. He woke up Sunday morning and he went. He did not make pancakes. He did not have a second coffee. He did not give himself the window that would become the reason. He put on clothes while Maya was still asleep, wrote her a note in the large, clear letters she could read without help. Went next door, back soon, cereal is on the counter, and he walked out into the Sunday morning before he could stop himself. The air was still cool, the particular dry coolness of early morning before August reasserted itself. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block a sprinkler was running. He walked the 3 houses between his and Vivian's on the sidewalk, not through the yards, because walking through the yards would have felt like he was sneaking, and he was done with anything that felt like he was approaching this sideways. He knocked on her door. There was a pause, maybe 15 seconds, and then the sound of movement inside, and then the door opened. Vivian was in the reading glasses. He'd only ever seen them that one time in December, and here they were again, slightly crooked on her face, the kind of crooked that said she'd grabbed them off a surface without looking. She was in a loose gray t-shirt and the dark sweatpants, and her hair was down, and she had a paperback in one hand with her thumb holding the page, and she looked at him with no particular surprise, or if there was surprise, she absorbed it the way she absorbed most things, without letting it reorganize her face. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He stood on her porch and realized, now that he was here, that the version of this he'd rehearsed in his head had not included the part where she answered the door looking like that, like someone mid-morning, mid-book, completely herself, and how that version of her made his carefully assembled sentences feel like they belonged in a different conversation. Can I come in?" She looked at him for a moment, not assessing exactly, reading, maybe. She had a way of reading people that was precise without being uncomfortable, like she was noting things without collecting them against you. "Yeah," she said. "Of course." She stepped back from the door. Her house smelled like coffee and something faintly herbal. She had plants on most of the windowsills, actual tended plants rather than the ones that exist as decorations and are never spoken to until they die. The living room was lived in the specific way of someone who actually used the space. A blanket on the couch in the arrangement of someone who had been sitting there, 2 books on the coffee table, a coffee mug with steam still rising slightly. She set the paperback on the table face down, the gesture of someone who intended to come back to it, and she folded her arms loosely across her chest and looked at him. "Do you want coffee?" "I'm fine." "Okay." She didn't push it, she waited. He had a speech, or something approaching one. He had words arranged in a sequence that had seemed, at 6:15 this morning, like they would carry the weight of what he needed to say. Standing in her living room, with her looking at him with those glasses still slightly crooked and the Sunday morning pressing quietly against the windows, the arranged words felt inadequate in a way that was almost funny. He said, "I couldn't sleep." "Okay," she said again, same tone, still waiting. "I kept thinking about what you said yesterday." He watched her face. "At the barbecue." Something shifted in her expression. Not much. A small tightening, maybe, the way people look when something they said out loud is now coming back to them in a context they can't fully predict. He started, and then he stopped, because starting with the thing you said about people thinking we were dating felt like naming a joke, and it wasn't a joke, and they both knew it wasn't a joke, and he didn't want to start from a place that let either of them pretend it was. "You said I hope they do," he said instead. Direct. No comedy packaging on it. "And I spent the whole night thinking about it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She unfolded her arms, and her hands went to the back of the couch, resting there. She looked at him in the careful, honest way she had. "Landon, let me finish," he said. Not sharply, just, He needed to get it out before the careful part of him caught up with the brave part. I've been thinking about it, and I keep going back over things. Like last December, the tape. The tape, she repeated, and he could see in her face that she knew exactly what he meant. You had your back door unlocked like you'd just been expecting me at midnight, and I thought at the time it was that's just how Vivian is, and the park runs with Maya, and the casserole. He stopped. I filed all of it under she's a good person and a good neighbor, and I let it stay there. For 2 years I let it stay there. She was watching him. She hadn't looked away and she hadn't moved, and there was something in her steadiness that made it easier to keep going. I think I knew, he said, quieter. Somewhere I think I knew that what you were doing wasn't just neighborly, but I didn't let myself look at it because looking at it meant. He stopped again and then just said it. It meant I had to admit what I was doing too. The Sunday morning was very quiet around them. Vivian took her hands off the back of the couch. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not closed off, not guarded, but careful in a way he hadn't seen from her before, like she was deciding how much of herself to hand over. I wasn't trying to hide it, she said finally. I wasn't running a campaign. A small pause. When you're around someone and you like them, you act like it. That's all I was doing. How long? He asked. She pressed her lips together briefly. A while. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. She was quiet for a second, then, do you want to sit down? I feel like this is a sitting down conversation. They sat. Her on the couch, him in the chair across from it, which maintained a distance that felt simultaneously necessary and slightly absurd given what they were talking about. She pulled the blanket across her lap, a habit, not a retreat, and she looked at him with the reading glasses still on her face, and he thought, distantly, that he should probably tell her they were still crooked, but that thought belonged to a different kind of moment than this one. I noticed you, she said, probably about 3 months after I moved in. I noticed you in the way that it was specific, not just like, there's my neighbor, more like, I started paying attention to your patterns without meaning to. When you left in the mornings, when you got back, the way you were with Maya. She paused. The way you were with Maya, mostly. He didn't say anything. She'd come out the front door ahead of you and you waited. You never made her hurry. Even when you were clearly running late, you just waited for her to come down the steps at whatever pace she needed, and you'd hand her the backpack without making a production of it. She looked at the coffee table. I was standing at my window eating toast and watching that, and I thought, that's a good man. That's someone doing something hard and doing it quietly and without any expectation of credit. He looked down at his hands. And then the more I was around you, the more it kept being confirmed. Everything I expected to find some crack in, you kept just being. She said it in a self-aware way that acknowledged how it sounded. I'm not painting you perfect. I know you're not perfect. But the things that weren't perfect were also just human, normal, not deal breakers, the opposite of deal breakers. Vivian, I know what you're going to say. I don't think you do. She looked at him. You're going to say something about the money, or about the gap, or some version of why would someone like you. That wasn't what I was going to say. He met her eyes. I was going to say that I'm sorry it took me this long. That stopped her. He could see it stop her. A small, visible pause, like a step she hadn't expected and had to catch herself on. I spent 2 years having you just present in my life, genuinely present in the way that matters, the practical daily way. And I accepted it without looking at it. He shook his head slightly. That's not... I should have looked. She was quiet for a moment. You were busy. I was scared, he said. That's more accurate. He said it matter-of-factly, not fishing for reassurance, just naming it honestly the way she'd always been honest with him. Not of you, of getting it wrong, of putting Maya through something I wasn't sure of looking at something I wanted and deciding the wanting was enough to act on. And now? He looked at her. She had her head slightly tilted, the glasses still crooked, the blanket still across her lap, and she looked Not like someone waiting to be convinced, like someone who had been patient for a long time and was now just watching the moment arrive and trying to gauge its shape. "Now," he said. I looked. The morning stayed quiet around them. Then Vivian said, "Okay," and the way she said it was not small at all. It was the word that meant something had been decided, or rather that something that had already been decided was now acknowledged between them, and the acknowledging of it changed the shape of the room. "Okay," he said back. She almost smiled. "You want that coffee now?" "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." They moved to the kitchen. She poured. He sat on the same stool he'd sat on that December night with the tape, and she stood on the other side of the counter with her mug, and the conversation, which had been building for days and possibly years, didn't stop there. It changed shape. The heavy lifting of it was done, and what came after was something different, easier in the bones. The kind of conversation that happens when two people stop navigating around something and start moving toward it instead. She told him the rose bush had been her mother's, or rather, her mother had had one in the yard where Vivian grew up, and when her mother died 4 years ago, Vivian had taken a cutting and transplanted it every time she moved. It had died twice and she'd restarted from a new cutting both times, which was not, botanically, the same plant anymore, but felt like the same thing. "Don't read too deep into it," she said. "I'm not reading anything into it," he said. "You have a look on your face." "I'm just listening." "You have a look," she said again, but she wasn't uncomfortable about it. She looked down at her mug. "It's just a plant." "Sure." "Stop." He wasn't doing anything, but he let her have it. He told her about Claire, not at length, but with enough honesty to fill in the shape of it. How it hadn't been a catastrophic ending, how there was no villain in it, how the hardest part hadn't been the leaving, but the period after when he'd had to rebuild what he understood a family to be without the architecture he'd assumed it would have. He told her that Maya asked about her mother sometimes, not with pain exactly, more with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a child who is gathering information about her own story, and that he tried to answer those questions in a way that left room for complexity rather than collapsing it into something simple. Vivian listened the way she always listened, without filling the silence with reassurance, without redirecting toward the bright side, just receiving it. He had always liked that about her, the not fixing of things that didn't need fixing, just hearing them. They talked for 2 hours. It did not feel like 2 hours. It felt like the right amount of time for something that had been building for 2 years to finally arrive at its own natural pace. By the end of it, the Sunday morning had become Sunday afternoon, and Maya had texted him twice. She had found the note, she had had the cereal, she was now conducting what she described as important research with Theo involving a magnifying glass and the backyard. And Landon had sent back a thumbs up and stayed at Vivian's kitchen counter. When he finally stood up to go, he was at the door and she was behind him, and he turned around. "I'm not good at this part," he said. "I'm just going to tell you that up front." She looked at him steadily. "Which part?" "The beginning. The saying how I feel, acting on things instead of just sitting with them." "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I've been watching you not act on things for 2 years. There was no meanness in it, just fact, and under the fact, something fond. I'm not expecting something I know you can't give. She paused. "I need you to actually be in it, if you're in it." "I'm in it," he said. "Okay." "I mean it. I know you do." She leaned against the doorframe. "That's why I said okay." He walked home through the Sunday afternoon with the late summer light slanting across Maplewood Drive, and the air had that particular weight of August moving toward September, and the crooked lawn chair on his back porch still needed fixing, and the grass still needed cutting, and Maya would need lunch soon. All of it was exactly the same as it had been yesterday, the street, the houses, the ordinary architecture of his daily life. And all of it, underneath, was different. He opened his front door and Maya appeared at the top of the stairs with the magnifying glass in her hand. The research apparently paused. "Dad," she said, "did you know that ants always walk in the same direction?" "I did not know that," he said. "Theo says they're communicating. I think they just don't know there are other directions." He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at her. "That's a pretty good theory. She considered it. Then, "Are you happy today? You look different." He put his hand on the banister. "I think so, yeah." Maya looked at him for another second with that evaluating look, then apparently decided the answer was satisfactory. "Okay," she said, and disappeared back toward her room to resume the research. He stood at the bottom of the stairs in the quiet of his own house and felt not the clean, organized feeling of a decision made and implemented, not the resolution of something that was over. The feeling was more like standing at the start of a road you'd been looking at from a distance for a long time, and having finally walked up to it, and putting your foot on it, and finding that it was solid. It was terrifying. It was also, in a way he hadn't expected, an enormous relief. The first 2 weeks were easy in the way that beginnings are sometimes easy. Not because there were no complications, but because the complications hadn't arrived yet, and the new thing between them was still fresh enough to override the practical weight of real life. They didn't announce anything. There was no conversation about what to call it or how to present it to the neighborhood. No deliberate decision made about what Maplewood Drive was or wasn't allowed to know. It simply shifted, the way the light shifts when a cloud moves off the sun. The same world, differently illuminated. Vivian started coming to his side of the fence instead of talking over it. He stopped texting her with the slightly formal precision of someone who was aware they were texting their neighbor, and started texting her the way you text someone whose proximity to your daily life has been reclassified. Small things. A photo of a gas station sign that reminded him of the one she'd sent him, payback with no caption. A question about whether she'd seen that the Delgado family was getting new siding, because the color they'd chosen was a topic of significant neighborhood discussion. A text at 10:30 on a Tuesday that was just, "Maya says you promised her a rematch at Uno." She had. She texted back, "Tell her I've been training." He showed Maya the text. Maya's expression went very serious. "She doesn't know what she's getting into," she said, and Landon had to look away so she wouldn't see him smile. The Uno rematch happened on a Wednesday evening around the kitchen table, and Vivian lost in a way that suggested she had not, in fact, been training. She accepted the loss with more grace than Maya extended to her. Maya had a mild victory lap that lasted slightly longer than was strictly necessary, and then Maya had gone to bed, and it was just the two of them at the kitchen table with the cards still spread out between them and the evening going quietly outside. "She shuffled the deck when I wasn't looking," Vivian said. "She absolutely did," Landon agreed, "and you allowed it." "I encourage strategic creativity." Vivian looked at him over the table. "You're a terrible referee." "I'm not a referee, I'm a spectator. There's a difference." She started collecting the cards with the absent focus of someone whose mind was partly somewhere else. He watched her hands. She had elegant hands. He'd noticed that before and filed it somewhere unhelpful. The kind of hands that moved with an efficiency that suggested she'd learned to use them carefully. "She asked me something today," Vivian said without looking up. He waited. "She asked if I was your girlfriend." She set a stack of cards straight, edges aligned. She didn't say it like it was a big deal. She just asked, like she was checking a fact. Landon felt his pulse do something. "What did you say?" Vivian looked up. "I said, I didn't know yet, that it was something you and I were still figuring out." A pause. "Was that okay?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way to think about things involving Maya. "Yeah," he said. "That was the right thing to say?" She said okay, and then asked if we were going to have pancakes. Vivian's mouth curved slightly. "She pivots fast." "She's 7. Everything pivots to food or animals." "Efficient," Vivian said. He reached across the table and took the cards from her hands, not roughly, just took them. Finished squaring the deck, set it aside. And when he looked up, she was watching him with that steady, reading expression she had, the one that saw more than most people were comfortable showing. "For what it's worth," he said, "I know what I'd call it." She didn't look away. "Then say it." "You're my girlfriend," he said, plainly, without packaging. "If you want to be." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went past slowly, headlights sweeping briefly across the window, and then gone. "Yeah," Vivian said, "I want to be." It was not a movie moment. Nobody kissed dramatically across the kitchen table. He didn't stand up and sweep the Uno cards to the floor with some grand gesture. They looked at each other in the ordinary kitchen light, and something settled between them, something that had been hovering for days and was now simply placed. Then she said, "Are you going to fix that lawn chair?" "What?" "The one on your back porch. It's been crooked since at least April." He stared at her. "You can see my back porch from your yard?" "Landon, we share a fence line. It hasn't been—" He stopped. "Has it actually been since April?" "March, maybe." He pressed his lips together. "I'll fix it this weekend." "I have a level you can borrow." "I have a level." "Do you, though?" He did not, as it happened, have a level. He borrowed hers. That was how the first 2 weeks went. Easy. The particular easy of two people who already knew each other well enough to skip the performance and go directly to the real thing. It felt, and Landon was aware that he was noting this with the slight caution of someone who knew from experience that ease was not the same as permanence. It felt like something that had been waiting to be itself for a long time and was finally allowed to be. Then the complications arrived. The first one came from a direction he should have anticipated and somehow didn't, which was his own sister. Denise Hayes was 38, lived 40 minutes north, had 2 kids of her own, and had been the person who picked up Landon's phone calls during the first year after Claire left, when the calls sometimes happened at 11 at night, and were less conversations than they were one person sitting in the rubble of their own life, while another person stayed on the line. She was sharp and protective, and not particularly diplomatic about either quality, and she drove down on a Saturday morning 3 weeks into Landon and Vivian's whatever it was, and arrived unannounced, which she did sometimes because Denise operated on the assumption that people who loved each other didn't need to schedule their presence. She came in through the front door. She had a key, from years ago, for emergencies, and had a somewhat expansive definition of the word, and found Landon in the kitchen and Maya in the backyard, and through the kitchen window visible at the other end of the shared fence line, Vivian in her own yard tending the rose bush. Denise set her purse on the counter. She looked at her brother's face, which was doing something she hadn't seen it do in a while. Then she looked through the window again. "Is that—" "Yeah." "Are you—" "Yeah." Denise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long?" "About 3 weeks officially, 2 years unofficially." She processed this. "And you're telling me now because—" "I'm telling you now because you drove here without calling." "I always drive here without calling." "I know. You're going to have to stop doing that." She turned fully toward him, arms crossed, in the posture she assumed when she was deciding whether to say the careful thing or the real thing. With Landon, she almost always went with the real thing. "She's rich." "Yeah. Like, actually rich." "I know what she is, Denise." "I'm not saying it like it's a problem. I'm saying it like—" She stopped, started again, more carefully, which was not her natural mode and cost her visible effort. "I'm saying it like, have you thought about what that means? Not just money, all of it. She lives differently than you live. She has a different world. She lives on Maplewood Drive. Landon. She has for 2 years. She gets Mr. Delgado's bins. I'm not saying she's a bad person." Denise said it with the patience of someone who needed to be precise. "I'm saying you're my brother, and the last time something didn't work, you rebuilt your entire life from scratch with a baby. And I am sitting here trying to figure out if this is something that makes sense or if it's something that just feels good right now." The kitchen was quiet between them. Landon knew his sister. He knew this came from love, and he knew that love was not always comfortable to receive. He also knew, and this was the part he had to stay honest about, that the question she was asking was not unfair. He had asked it himself in different forms in the dark of his bedroom over the past 3 weeks. "I hear you," he said. "Okay. But I need you to trust that I'm not doing something stupid. I never said, 'You had the face.'" "What face?" "The one you had when I bought the truck." Denise opened her mouth and closed it again. "That truck needed work." "The truck was fine. It needed so much—" "Denise." He said her name and she stopped. "Come and meet her." She met her. Vivian came around through the side gate when Landon waved her over. still in her gardening state, dirt on her forearm, the worn gloves tucked in her back pocket, and she looked at Denise Hayes with the kind of composed, open attention that she brought to most things. And Denise looked back with the full, unguarded assessment of someone who loved fiercely and was not pretending otherwise. They shook hands. Then Denise said, "I'm going to need you to know up front that I ask direct questions." And Vivian said, "I find that easier than the alternative." And Denise looked at her for another second, and then looked at Landon with a fractional shift in her expression that meant something had been partially answered, though not everything, and that she was reserving her full verdict. They had coffee in the backyard, the lawn chair had been fixed, Vivian's level returned, and Maya climbed into Denise's lap within the first 10 minutes the way she always did, because Denise was one of those adults who seemed to have a frequency children responded to, a kind of low warmth that children picked up before they had words for it. The conversation moved from polite to real in the gradual way of a morning with nowhere urgent to be, and Landon watched his sister and Vivian navigate each other with the particular attention of someone who cared about both outcomes. "It wasn't flawless," Denise asked at one point, with her characteristic lack of cushioning, how someone with Vivian's professional life managed the kind of presence she'd apparently maintained in the neighborhood, and the question had an edge to it, not hostile but testing. Vivian didn't deflect. She said that she'd built her company in a specific way to allow her to work from anywhere, that she had a team she trusted with the daily operations, and that the reason she'd chosen a neighborhood like Maplewood in the first place was because she'd spent years in an environment where everything was professional proximity dressed as connection, and she'd needed something that was actually real. Denise had listened to this without comment. Then she'd said, "What happens when the work gets demanding? Because it does, right? There are periods." "There are," Vivian said, "and I'm not going to tell you they don't affect things because they do, but—" A pause, brief and considered. "I've been managing two things at once for a long time. The difference is that before, one of them was always just work." Denise had looked at her steadily for a moment. Then she'd looked at her brother. Whatever she saw in his face, she made a decision with it privately and didn't announce the decision because that was how Denise worked. She stayed for lunch. She was warmer at lunch than she had been at coffee. When she left, she hugged Maya, nodded at Vivian in a way that was not yet warmth, but was not opposition, and walked to her car. She texted Landon when she got home. "She's not what I expected. That's not a bad thing. Just be careful." He texted back, "I know." She sent a thumbs up. That was the end of it, for now. The second complication came from Vivian's side, and it was larger. His name was Daniel Rourke. He was 44. He ran one of the 3 largest investment banks in the Midwest, and he had been, for approximately 9 months the previous year, something in Vivian's life that was never fully defined and had ended in the particular unresolved way of things between two people whose professional lives created more proximity than their personal relationship warranted. Landon found out about Daniel Rourke not because Vivian hid him. She didn't. But because the information arrived in pieces, across different conversations, the way things about a person's past tend to arrive when you're getting to know them in the real way rather than the curated way. The first piece was a passing mention, a name in a story about a business negotiation that had gone sideways. Then a reference to a dinner that had been professionally required and personally uncomfortable. Then, eventually, on a Thursday evening in Vivian's kitchen when the conversation had gone somewhere honest, the fuller picture. Daniel Rourke had wanted something from Vivian that she had not been prepared to give, and the ending of it had been managed rather than felt, and the managing of it had left behind a specific residue. Not devastation, more like the residue of a thing handled efficiently that you later wished you'd been allowed to feel fully. "Why are you telling me this now?" Landon asked. "Because he texted me yesterday," she said. The kitchen was quiet. "What did he say?" "That he was going to be in Columbus next month for a conference, that he'd like to have dinner." She had her mug in both hands, looking at it. "He said he's been thinking about some things." Landon sat with that for a moment. "What did you say back?" "Nothing yet." He turned the question over carefully, because this was exactly the kind of moment where he had two options. The version where he said the thing that was safe and controlled, or the version where he said the true thing, and the true thing had the potential to expose more of him than he was comfortable exposing. He went with the true thing. He'd been doing that more lately. It was uncomfortable. It seemed to be the right direction. "I need you to know," he said, "that I'm not going to tell you what to say back." She looked up from the mug. "That's your call. I'm not going to... I won't do the thing where I perform being okay with it and then hold it against you later, but I'm also not going to issue a position on who you see or talk to." He looked at her. "But I'll tell you what's true for me, which is that I'm in this. I meant that when I said it, and whatever you decide to do with his text, I need you to decide it for the right reason." "What's the right reason?" she asked quietly. "Because of what you want. Not because of what's easy or what avoids an awkward conversation or what you think I need to hear." He paused. "What do you actually want?" She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen held the sound of the refrigerator and the distant noise of the neighborhood outside and nothing else. "I want to not have dinner with Daniel Rourke," she said. "Okay. I want that before you, for the record, before any of this. I wasn't..." She stopped, and he saw something move through her face that was rarer than he'd seen from her. A crack in the composure, not dramatic, just real. "He wanted me to be a particular kind of person, the version that fit cleanly into the world he operated in. And I kept trying to locate her, that version, and she just wasn't..." She stopped again, set the mug down. "She wasn't there." Landon was quiet. "I'm not telling you this so you'll say the right thing," she said. "I know. I'm telling you because you asked what I wanted, and that's part of the answer." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted someone who wanted the actual version, not the one that fit." He got up from his stool. He walked around the counter, which was a small distance that felt, in that moment, like a deliberate one. She stayed where she was, and he stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him, and he put his hand against the side of her face. Not a grand gesture, just his palm against her cheek. Warm, still. And she closed her eyes for a moment. "Text him back," Landon said quietly. "Tell him you're seeing someone." She opened her eyes. "That simple?" "That simple." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached up and put her hand over his, not pulling it away, just resting hers on top of it. "Okay," she said. She texted Daniel Rourke that night, and Landon did not ask what she said, and she did not volunteer the specific words, and the subject closed in the clean way of things that are handled honestly, and therefore have no remaining corners to catch on. But the conversation left something behind in Landon that had nothing to do with Daniel Rourke. He sat on the back porch that night, in the fixed lawn chair, correctly level now, and thought about what she'd said. Someone who wanted the actual version. He'd felt something land in him when she said it, recognition and responsibility in equal parts, because it went both directions. She was asking to be the actual version with him, which meant he had to be the actual version too, not the managed one, not the careful, maintained distance one he'd been running for years with anyone who got close. He was aware that there was a version of himself he hadn't shown anyone, not fully, since Claire left. Not Denise, not the handful of friends he kept, certainly not the 2 women he'd briefly dated in the years between then and now. The version that was tired in a specific way, that had gotten so accustomed to carrying things alone that he'd started to believe that was just who he was. The guy who handled it, the guy who had it together, the grill guy, for that matter, with his clear job and visible results, where nothing required the exposure of anything internal. Vivian had been prying the edges of that version loose for 2 years without knowing it. Or maybe she knew. Probably she knew. She paid attention in ways that most people didn't. He thought about the conversation over the fence last November. Not the December tape night, the one before that, earlier in the fall. She'd asked how he was, and he'd said fine, reflexively. And she'd paused and said, "Actually, how are you?" And there was a difference in the way she said the second version that made deflection feel dishonest rather than protective. So he hadn't deflected. He'd said he was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, and she'd said she understood that. And they'd stood at the fence in the cold for 20 minutes talking about nothing that was remarkable and everything that was real. And afterward he had gone inside and felt lighter. Not fixed, just lighter. She did that. She had been doing that. He owed her the actual version in return. He was working on it. The third complication arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, 3.5 weeks into things, and it arrived in the form of a phone call from his supervisor at the distribution company. His name was Greg Folsom, and he was a decent man who delivered bad news with the blunt directness of someone who had decided years ago that cushioning things was a kindness that primarily served the deliverer. The company was restructuring. The logistics management team at Landon's level was being consolidated. His position was being eliminated at the end of the month. Landon sat in the parking lot of the company in his truck after the call and looked at the steering wheel for a period of time he couldn't have accurately reported. It was not catastrophic. He had savings, not enormous ones, but enough. He was 32 with a solid employment history and marketable skills in a field that was always moving. He had options. He told himself these things in the parking lot, methodically, the way he processed information when the information was unwelcome. Gather the facts, assess the actual situation without inflating the stakes, identify the next step. The next step was, tell Maya as little as possible until he knew more, and then tell her only what was true. Update his resume, make calls. He did not, driving home, think about Vivian. Or rather, he thought about her and then pushed the thought sideways because what arrived with it was something he hadn't expected and wasn't proud of. Not jealousy, not resentment, something clumsier than that. The awareness that she was who she was and he was now, temporarily, unemployed, and the gap between those facts was not lost on him. He was not someone who needed a woman to support him. He knew that. He also knew, rationally, that Vivian had never operated in a way that created any hierarchy between them, never used money as leverage, never made him feel the distance of it. Knowing those things and feeling the tightening in his chest anyway were not incompatible. Both were true at once. He was human enough to feel it, and honest enough not to pretend it away. He told her that evening. He didn't let it sit. Letting it sit would have let the thing grow in the dark, where things grow badly. I lost my job today, he said, standing in her doorway. Not inside yet, just at the door, like he wasn't sure if he was bringing something into her house that should stay outside. She looked at him without alarm, without the practiced compassion of someone managing another person's emotion. She just looked at him. "Come in," she said. He came in. He told her. The whole shape of it. The call, the parking lot, the assessment he'd run, the options. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you need right now? From me?" He'd expected her to say something practical. She often went practical. It was a reflex, the problem-solving nature of someone whose brain defaulted to solutions. He'd braced for it slightly, for the gentle, well-meaning pivot toward, "I know some people. I could make a call, because she could, and she might," and he didn't know yet if he could receive that without something in him pulling back. But she didn't say any of that. She just asked what he needed. He said, "I think I just needed to say it out loud to someone." She nodded. "Okay? That's it for right now." "Okay," she said again. Steady. "Do you want dinner? I was going to make something mediocre." He almost laughed. The tightness in his chest shifted. "How mediocre are we talking?" "I found a recipe I have low confidence in. It might be great. It might be pasta with good intentions." "I'll take my chances," he said. They made dinner. It was, in fact, mediocre. The sauce was under-seasoned and she'd added too much pasta water, which she acknowledged without defensiveness. And they ate it anyway, and the conversation moved around the edges of the job situation without living there, which was exactly right, which let him breathe. At the end of the evening, when he was at the door again, she stopped him. "I want to say something," she said, "and I need you to hear it the way I mean it." He waited. "I'm not going to offer to fix this for you." She said it plainly, looking him in the eye. "Not because I don't want to help, but because you are fully capable of handling this and you need to do it in a way that you own. And I know," she paused, "I know the money thing is in the room right now. I can see it in how you came to the door tonight, standing outside like you were deciding whether to come in." He didn't say anything. "I need you to hear that it has nothing to do with who you are to me, not one single thing." Her voice was even and direct and completely without performance. "You could be between jobs for a year and that number would not move for me. I am with you because of who you are, not what your employment situation looks like at any given month, and I know you know that." "I know that," he said. "But But knowing something and feeling it are different things sometimes. Yeah, she said, they are. She looked at him for a moment. Give yourself a minute to feel it, then let it go. He went home. He sat in the kitchen with the lights low. Maya was asleep. The house was quiet in its particular way. He thought about Vivian saying, I am with you because of who you are. Not because of what you have. Not despite what you don't, just who you are. He had been heard and helped and fed mediocre pasta and looked at honestly by someone who had every resource to offer him the polished version and had chosen instead to offer the real one. He thought about what she'd said about Daniel Rourke, someone who wanted the actual version. He was beginning to understand, sitting there in the quiet kitchen, what it meant to be someone who offered the same. It was not easy. It was the least easy thing he'd done in years, but the difficulty of it felt, and he turned this over slowly, making sure he meant it, the difficulty felt like the right kind, like effort that was going somewhere, like a road that was difficult because it was real, not because it was wrong. He went to bed. In the morning, he updated his resume. He made the calls. He moved forward. He found a job 6 weeks later. Not the version of the job he'd had before. The new position was at a regional supply chain consulting firm, smaller company, different structure, work that required him to think differently than he had at the distribution center. The title was better. The commute was worse. The salary was, after the initial sting of comparison, something he could work with. He'd gotten the offer on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in his truck in a parking garage downtown after the second interview, and he'd called Denise first, old reflex. And she'd said, I told you, with the emphatic confidence of someone who had not actually told him any such specific thing, but who deserved credit for the general encouragement. Then he'd texted Vivian, got the offer. She texted back in under a minute. Of course you did. Dinner tonight? I'll make something that isn't mediocre. He'd said yes. She'd made roasted chicken with vegetables that were properly seasoned, an undeniable upgrade from the pasta incident, and they'd eaten at her kitchen table with the windows open because the September air had finally softened into something tolerable, and Maya had been there too, working on a drawing at the end of the table with the intense focus of someone who considered their art non-negotiable, regardless of whatever adult conversation was happening nearby. It was a good evening, a simple one. The kind that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening and only reveals its weight later when you're looking back at the collection of evenings that built something. That was what the following months were, mostly. A collection. September moved into October with the particular Ohio efficiency of a season that does not linger. The trees along Maplewood Drive going from green to orange to stripped in what felt like 3 weekends, the mornings developing that raw edge that made the coffee taste better. The neighborhood contracting slightly the way neighborhoods do in fall, people spending more time inside. The easy outdoor sprawl of summer replaced by the warmer, closer version of community that happens when people come together by choice rather than by the weather. Simply putting them all in the same outdoor space. Landon started the new job, and it was difficult in the specific way of any new thing. The learning curve of different systems, different people, different expectations. The period where you are competent in the abstract and still fumbling with the particulars. He came home tired in a new way. Not the defeated tired of the last weeks at the old job, when the work had felt like it was happening around him rather than because of him, but the productive tired of effort applied towards something building. He and Vivian found a rhythm. It was not a grand or dramatic rhythm. It was the quiet, unglamorous rhythm of two people who have actual lives, integrating those lives with the care that real integration requires. Tuesday evenings, she came to his side for dinner more often than not. He cooked, she helped in the peripheral way of someone who was present in the kitchen, but understood that the kitchen had a primary operator. Thursday evenings, they walked, usually after Maya was in bed, a 40-minute loop through the neighborhood that had started once as a practical suggestion and had become, without announcement, the anchor of their week. The walks were not romantic in any performed sense. They were just time, moving time. The kind where conversation could go anywhere because there was no destination to arrive at and no context to maintain. She told him about her week on the walks, the actual version, not the curated professional summary, but the one with the frustrations and the near misses and the moments where she'd made a call she wasn't sure about. He listened the way she'd always listened to him, without redirecting, without preloading his response, just receiving it. He told her about the new job, about learning to navigate a team where he was the new voice in a room that already had its established dynamics. She asked questions that were specific rather than general, which he appreciated because general questions about work were easy to answer with nothing. Maya, for her part, had processed the shift in Vivian's status with the same practical efficiency she applied to most things. Within a month, she had stopped asking any version of the girlfriend question and had simply recategorized Vivian into the working architecture of her daily life, which was the highest possible form of acceptance she had available. She saved Vivian things, drawings, interesting rocks, specific pieces of information she encountered that she determined Vivian would want to know. She informed Vivian in early October that the tree at the end of the ferry road needed a name, and Vivian had said it should be the child's decision, and Maya had deliberated for 4 days and then announced that its name was Gerald. Gerald, Landon had repeated. He looks like a Gerald, Maya said, and that was the end of it. Vivian had bought a small painted stone and placed it near the base of Gerald, which Maya had received with a solemnity that suggested the gesture had been correctly calibrated. These were the things that accumulated, not the significant moments, or not only those, but the small, specific, unremarkable ones that don't make it into any summary of a relationship but are, in practice, what the relationship is made of. It was not perfect. Landon would have been suspicious of perfect, would have felt the absence of friction as evidence of something withheld rather than something whole. There were evenings that were just hard for reasons neither of them had caused. The kind of hard that comes from two people who each carried their own weight, and sometimes, when those weights landed in the same space at the same time, the space got heavy. There were nights when he was quieter than she needed, and mornings when she was more somewhere else than he could reach. There was a Tuesday in October when they'd had a genuine argument, not a blow-up, not dramatic, but an argument with edges, about something that started as a practical disagreement about plans and arrived, as arguments between people who know each other well tend to arrive at something beneath the practical. It had started with a fundraising dinner. Vivian's firm held one annually, a formal event, the kind that had a dress code and a guest list and a table arrangement that reflected the professional architecture of her world. She'd mentioned it to Landon in passing, a week in advance, with the slightly careful phrasing of someone who was deciding how to frame an invitation without making it sound like a requirement. "It's not mandatory that you come," she said. "It's not a thing I need, but I'd like you to be there, if you're comfortable with it." He'd said yes. He'd meant it when he said it. Then he'd spent the following week thinking about what that room would look like, and who would be in it, and what version of himself he was going to present in a space that was entirely hers, her world, her people, her environment. And somewhere in that week, the yes had started to develop complications he hadn't anticipated when he gave it. He showed up at the event in the suit he owned, which was a good suit but which he recognized. The moment he walked into the venue was not the language of this particular room. Not poorly dressed, just visibly not native. The room was the kind of room that had its own gravity, tall ceilings, the kind of lighting that cost money. 200 people who moved through the space with the ease of people for whom this was Tuesday. Vivian found him near the entrance. She was in a dark green dress that was simple and expensive in the way that simple and expensive things are, and she looked at him with genuine warmth and took his arm and said, "I'm glad you came." He said, "Yeah." She heard something in the yeah, because she always heard the things in the things he said. But this was not the place, and she was the host in this room. And they moved through the evening with the surface functioning correctly, even while underneath, he was managing something she could feel, and he wouldn't name. He managed it. He talked to people. He was not socially incapable. He knew how to hold a conversation, and several of the people at the table were genuinely interesting in the way of people who had built things and were willing to talk about the building rather than just the result. He ate food that was very good. He drank wine that was better than he was used to. He was fine. On the surface, entirely fine. On the drive home, Vivian said, "Talk to me. I'm fine. You've said 2 sentences in 20 minutes. I'm tired." Landon. He drove. The city moved past the windows. He could hear in his own silence how it sounded, not the honest tired he'd admitted to over the fence a year ago, but the managed kind, the variety that erected a wall and then described itself as privacy. I felt out of place, he said finally. Okay. Not because you did anything. You didn't. He shook his head. You were good the whole night. That room is not my room. And I kept thinking about how you move through it like it's nothing, and I'm over there trying to figure out which fork I'm supposed to be using. He heard himself, and it sounded smaller than it felt, which was the problem with saying true things. They didn't always translate with their original weight. There were 3 forks, Vivian said. I know. You used them correctly. I looked it up beforehand. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you looked up the fork order. 2 days ago, I watched a video. He could hear her deciding whether to smile, which she didn't allow, but it was audible in the quality of the silence. Landon, I don't care about the forks. I know you don't. That's not the point. Then what is? He turned onto the highway. The headlights reached into the dark ahead of them. The point is that your life has parts in it that I don't belong in naturally. And I can learn forks, and I can wear the suit, and I can hold the conversation. But I don't come from that world, and I'm never going to feel like I belong in it the way you do. And I guess I'm trying to figure out if that's ever going to... He stopped. If it becomes a thing. Vivian was quiet long enough that he glanced sideways at her. She was looking at the road ahead, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression was the particular one she had when she was choosing her words with genuine care, not performing deliberateness, actually doing it. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. That room tonight, the fundraiser, the people in it, the whole architecture of it, that is a part of my professional life that I am required to maintain. It is not... She paused. It is not the part I come home to. It is not the part that I am choosing when I choose what my actual life looks like. She turned to look at him. I left a world that was entirely that room. That was the whole world. The events and the dinners and the networking and the version of yourself you project in those spaces. I left it geographically and deliberately. I moved to Maplewood Drive because I did not want that to be everything. He said nothing. You feeling like you're not native to that room? I need you to understand that I find that completely irrelevant because you are native to the things that matter to me. The actual daily things, the walks, the kitchen, the lawn chair, a beat. Gerald. He almost laughed. He didn't quite. I'm not asking you to become someone who's comfortable at those dinners, she said. I'm asking you to trust that I know the difference between the parts of my life and which ones I'm building toward. He drove. The highway lights were sparse out here, long stretches of dark between them. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For going quiet instead of just saying it. Yeah. Not forgiving him too fast, not punishing him either. Just honest. That one I'm going to need you to work on. I know. I can't read you when you go quiet. I make it up, and I'm not always right. I know, he said again. I'm working on it. Okay. They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that was different from the earlier one, not closed off, just settling, the kind of quiet that follows a real conversation. He pulled into Maplewood Drive and parked, and they sat for a moment before getting out, the engine ticking as it cooled. The fork thing, Vivian said. Don't. I'm just saying, and you watched a video. Please do not make this a thing. I'm not making it a thing, She was smiling now, the small, private one. You watched a fork video for me. For the record, he said, the video was 14 minutes long, and the host was very serious about it. She laughed. A real one. Not the polished version, the one that came from somewhere unguarded. He looked at her in the dark of the truck cab and felt something in his chest that was warm and certain and entirely unrelated to anything a fork video deserved credit for. Come here, he said. She did. The argument, when he thought about it later, had not been about the dinner or the forks, or even about her world versus his. It had been about the gap between the managed version of himself and the real one. The gap that kept appearing in specific moments. The one that required him to choose, repeatedly, whether to close it or maintain it. He was getting better at closing it.
Not consistently, not naturally yet, but better.
It was the kind of progress that didn't look like much from the outside and felt, from the inside, like moving through something with resistance. Vivian was patient with it in the specific way of someone who understood resistance from the inside, who had done their own work on their own gaps, and who therefore didn't treat his as a problem to be solved quickly. November arrived. Thanksgiving that year was at Denise's, which meant Landon and Maya drove north on a Wednesday evening through light rain, and it meant that Vivian, for the first time, tentatively, with the acknowledgement that this was a choice Denise would need to have made willingly, was invited. Denise had made the offer herself. That was how Landon knew something had shifted between the two of them, because Denise did not extend her Thanksgiving table to people she was reserving judgment on. She extended it to people she had made a decision about, and the decision was usually, once made, permanent. Vivian had said yes with the careful honesty of someone who understood what the invitation meant and did not take it lightly. She'd asked Landon, the night before, what Denise's family was like, what the house was like, what the day was usually like, not nervously, but genuinely. She wanted to show up correctly, not in the performance sense, but in the sense of showing up as herself in a way that fit the space. He described Denise's house, loud, cluttered with the comfortable evidence of 2 kids and a dog, a kitchen that always had 3 things going simultaneously, and a table that was never quite big enough for everyone invited. He described Denise's husband, Ray, who was a retired high school football coach and communicated primarily in sports metaphors and genuine warmth. He'd described Denise herself, direct, fiercely loving, the kind of person who didn't do pleasantries as a substitute for connection. Vivian had listened to all of this and said, "Okay, I can do that." She had, as it turned out, done considerably more than that. She had arrived with a pie, not a store-bought one, an actual pie that she had made, which Landon had not known she was capable of, and which she had not mentioned, appearing at his door Thanksgiving morning with it wrapped in a dish towel and a look that said she was not inviting comment on the pie's existence. "You made a pie," he said. "I made an attempt at a pie." She looked at it. It's structurally sound. At Denise's, the pie had been received with the kind of enthusiasm that pies inspire in houses with children, which is to say, immediately and without ceremony. Denise had looked at it, looked at Vivian, and said, "You made this?" in a tone that had less skepticism than Landon had expected. "My mom had a recipe," Vivian said, simple and clear. Denise had looked at her for 1 second more, then said, "Come in the kitchen," which, in Denise's house, was the highest available invitation. Landon had spent most of Thanksgiving watching the two of them orbit each other in his sister's kitchen and feeling something he couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or the particular warmth of watching 2 people you loved separately begin to locate each other. They were different in almost every measurable way. Denise was loud where Vivian was quiet. Vivian was contained where Denise spilled over edges, but they were both, underneath everything, people who said what they meant and meant what they said. And that particular frequency had a way of recognizing itself. By the end of the night, they were not friends. That took longer, took more ordinary time than a single holiday, but they were something. The beginning of something that had its own shape and didn't need him in the middle of it, which was the specific version he'd hoped for. Maya had fallen asleep in the car on the way home, boneless and entirely finished with the day in the way of children who had extracted everything available from an experience. Vivian rode back with them, and in the dark of the car with Maya asleep in the back seat, she put her hand on the center console, palm up, without saying anything, and he put his hand in hers and drove the rest of the way home one-handed through the November dark. They didn't talk much. The day had been full enough. Sometimes full days earned their quiet endings. December arrived, and with it the anniversary of the tape night, a year since he'd knocked on her door at midnight for something minor and stayed for something that, in retrospect, had been more significant than either of them had named at the time. He hadn't planned to acknowledge it. It wasn't the kind of date that was technically an anniversary of anything, but he'd thought about it, and thinking about it had felt like something worth not ignoring. He left a roll of tape on her porch. No note. She texted him 20 minutes after he'd done it. "Is this a joke or a gesture?" He texted back. "Both." She sent back a single laughing emoji, which she almost never used, And then, "Come over." He went over. She had tea already made. She'd started making 2 mugs whenever she heard him coming, which was a small domestic thing that hit him somewhere soft every time he registered it. And they sat in her kitchen, and it was nothing like the first time, and it was also exactly the same place. "A year ago, you were here for tape," she said. "A year ago, I told myself I was here for tape." She looked at him over her mug. "What were you actually here for?" He thought about it honestly. "I think I came over because I wanted to, and the tape was a reason that let me." "You needed a reason." "I thought I did." "Do you still?" she asked. He looked at her in the kitchen light. The reading glasses were somewhere else tonight, her hair down, the comfortable evening version of herself that he'd gotten to know over these months, in the specific way of knowing that came from accumulated ordinary time. The version that was entirely real and entirely hers, unperformed and unprepared for any particular audience. "No," he said, "not anymore." She nodded slowly, like that was the answer she'd been waiting to confirm. Not surprised, just confirming. The weeks between December and the New Year were the kind of weeks that stretched slightly in memory even as they moved quickly in real time. Christmas at his house with Maya and Denise's family, Vivian there too, in the fully integrated way of someone who had stopped being a guest and become a fixture. Maya had insisted on her being in the family photo with the 7-year-old's uncomplicated authority, and Denise had arranged everyone without comment. And the photo had come out slightly crooked because Ray had been the one taking it. But everyone was in it, and everyone was laughing about something that was already half forgotten by the time the shutter clicked. New Year's Eve, the 4 of them, him and Vivian, Denise and Ray, at Denise's house with the kids asleep early and the adults around the kitchen table playing cards badly and talking the way you talk at the end of a year when you've had enough of it, and also, unexpectedly, gotten some things right. Landon had looked around that table at 11:50 and felt something that he might have called contentment, if contentment weren't a word that implied stillness, and what he felt was more active than that. More like, this. This is the shape of the thing. This is what it looks like when it's working. He had not said any of that out loud. He had played his hand badly. He was a genuinely poor card player, which Vivian had discovered and documented with mild delight, and lost the round with dignity, and the year had turned over quietly while they were all mid-conversation, caught by it only when Ray noticed the clock and said, "Oh, Happy New Year," in the flat tone of someone for whom the midnight hour had always been somewhat arbitrary. They'd raised glasses. Maya had appeared at the top of the stairs, awoken by some internal alarm, or by the noise, or simply by the 7-year-old version of FOMO, and had announced from the landing, "Is it the New Year? Did I miss it?" And they'd laughed, and Landon had gone up and carried her back to bed, and she'd been asleep again by the time he laid her down. He'd come back down to the kitchen, and Vivian had been at the counter, her back to him, doing something with the glasses, and he'd stood in the doorway for a second, just looking at her. The ordinary, unposed version of her, comfortable in his sister's kitchen in the first minutes of the new year. And he had felt, fully and without the caution he'd been carrying for most of this, what it meant to have chosen correctly. Not perfectly. Not without complication or argument or the ongoing work of 2 people building something that neither of them had a blueprint for, but correctly. She turned and saw him in the doorway. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just looking." She looked at him with that reading expression. "You have a face." "I don't have a face." "You have the face you had at the Uno table." That was a completely different face. It really wasn't. He crossed the kitchen. She was still at the counter and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she tilted her head back slightly to look up at him, and he put his hands on either side of her face the way he had that evening in her kitchen in November, and this time he kissed her properly. Not the first time they had first kissed weeks ago. But this was different in the specific way that kisses are sometimes different when something has been confirmed, when the thing behind them is settled and certain and no longer new. When he stepped back, she was looking at him with the small private smile. "Happy New Year," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Outside, somewhere a few streets over, someone had set off a single firework. A small one, a burst of red that lit the window briefly and was gone before it could be fully identified. Maya would have loved it. Maya was asleep. The year that had just ended had taken things from him and given him others. The job, the adjustment, the months of learning to be in something real without retreating behind the managed version of himself. He was not finished learning that. He suspected he would not be finished learning it for a long time, but he was learning it, actively, with the daily evidence that it was worth learning. He helped Denise clean up the kitchen. Ray fell asleep on the couch with the sports channel on at a respectful volume. Vivian dried dishes next to him while Denise washed, and they talked about nothing important, about the card game, about a movie Denise wanted to see, about whether Gerald the tree would survive the winter. "Trees survive worse," Vivian said. "Maya will be devastated if he doesn't make it," Landon said. "Then he'll make it," Denise said, in the tone of someone who was not stating a botanical fact, but issuing an instruction to the universe. They drove home through streets that were quiet after midnight. The city briefly turned over into the New Year's first hours. Maya, asleep in the back. Vivian, in the passenger seat with her shoes off and her feet tucked up the way she sat in cars on long drives, looking out the window at the empty streets. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm thinking about what next year looks like." "What do you see?" She turned to look at him in the dark of the car, the passing streetlights moving across her face in slow intervals. "This," she said. "More of this. Different versions of these same things." He nodded. "Yeah." "Is that enough?" she asked. Not with doubt in it, more like she was asking him to confirm something she already believed. He glanced at her and then back at the road. "It's everything," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his on the gear shift, and he turned his palm up and held it, and they drove the last few blocks home through the beginning of the new year in the quiet, unhurried way of two people who were not in a hurry because finally they knew where they were going. The second January was different from the first. Not dramatically different. Landon Hayes was not living a dramatically different life in any measurable external sense. He still drove the same truck, still lived in the same house on Maplewood Drive, still had a daughter who negotiated bedtime with the persistence of a labor attorney, and who had recently developed an interest in rocks that had turned the windowsills of the house into a geological archive. The neighborhood looked the same. The lawn chair on the back porch was still the lawn chair, now correctly level, exactly as it had always been except for the 6 months it had listed slightly to the left, and he hadn't gotten to it. But January felt different because he felt different inside it, and the inside difference was the one that mattered. He'd been thinking, since the new year, about the ring. Not constantly, not obsessively. More like the way you think about something that you've already decided and are now working up the practical courage to execute. A low, persistent hum in the background of ordinary days, present without dominating. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't said it out loud even to himself, not directly, because saying it out loud meant beginning the sequence of things that followed it, and he needed to be sure before he began that sequence. Not sure in the way of someone who has no doubts. He was old enough and self-aware enough to know that no doubts was not a realistic condition for someone with his particular architecture. Sure in the way of when he imagined not asking, the alternative was unacceptable. That test, run quietly in February, had given him a clear answer. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee and Maya doing homework at the other end of the table. She was in second grade now. The homework was not taxing, but she approached it with a theatrical gravitas that suggested she believed otherwise. And he had, for reasons he couldn't trace, run the question, what if you didn't? What if things stayed as they were? Vivian 3 houses down, present in his daily life, real and continuous, just without the specific formalization of a question asked under whatever circumstances it eventually got asked. He'd sat with that image for about 45 seconds. It had felt wrong in the quiet, factual way of wearing shoes on the wrong feet. Not catastrophic, but fundamentally, unavoidably off. He'd put down his coffee and thought, okay, there it is. March arrived. He started looking at rings. This was, it turned out, a more complicated process than he had anticipated, partly because he did not know what he was doing and partly because the internet, when consulted on the subject of engagement rings, returned a volume of opinion and contradictory guidance that was genuinely overwhelming for someone who had walked into it expecting a simple transaction. He spent 2 evenings reading things he didn't fully understand about cuts and settings and metals, and by the end of the second evening, he had closed the laptop and called Denise. "I need help," he said. "With what?" He told her. The silence on the other end lasted approximately 3 seconds, which for Denise was practically a speechless eternity. "Finally," she said. "That's your response?" "Landon, I have been waiting for you to say this since Thanksgiving. Ray owes me $40. You had a bet. We had a friendly prediction."
When are you going? I don't know yet. I don't know what I'm doing. You're going to a jewelry store, not a press conference. I'll come with you. She came the following Saturday, driving down in the morning with the energy of someone who had been assigned a mission they found genuinely satisfying. They went to 3 stores. Denise had opinions about all of them, organized, specific, occasionally wrong, but delivered with enough confidence that the sales staff found her difficult to correct. At the second store, Landon had seen it. A simple ring, not elaborate, not the kind that announced itself from across a room. A solitaire with a clean setting, elegant in the way of things that knew what they were and didn't require decoration to make the point. He'd picked it up, held it, set it down, picked it up again. "That's the one," Denise said beside him. "How do you know?" "Because you picked it up twice." He'd bought it, driven home with it in his jacket pocket in a small velvet box that he was acutely aware of for the entire 40-minute drive, as though it had its own gravitational field. He'd put it in the back of his sock drawer when he got home, the most unimaginative hiding place available. Maya was 8. She was not going through his sock drawer. And then he'd gone about his evening with the composed exterior of a man who was not doing anything unusual. Maya had looked at him at dinner. "You're doing the face again." "I don't have a face." "You have it a lot lately." "Eat your food." She ate her food. She kept watching him sideways the way she always did when she suspected something was happening that had not been explained to her, which was a frequency she'd inherited from no one in particular and had developed entirely on her own. He told her in April. He'd thought about it for weeks, whether to tell her before or after, whether she was old enough to carry the information, whether telling her was the right shape for what he wanted the moment to be. Maya had been 8 for 2 months by then, old enough to understand what he was asking and what it meant, old enough to have feelings about it that deserved to be heard before the question was posed rather than after. He sat on the edge of her bed on a Tuesday night after her homework was done, and the room was in its habitual state of organized chaos, rocks on the windowsill and drawings pinned to the wall, and Gerald-related research materials on the desk. She had, over the winter, developed a comprehensive personal file on the tree's health and seasonal changes, which she updated with the dedication of a scientist and the aesthetic of someone who drew flowers in the margins. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. She looked up from the book she was reading. Something in his tone had correctly communicated the weight of it because she set the book down without being asked. "Is it about Vivian?" she said. "Yeah?" She waited. He told her he wanted to ask Vivian to marry him. He used the plain words, no softening, no age translation, because Maya had always responded better to the real version than to the managed one. He told her that Vivian would be part of their family in a way that was different from the way she was already. More permanent, more official, but also just more. He told her that nothing about her place in his life or in Vivian's life would shrink, that she wasn't being asked to make room. The space was getting larger, not redistributed. Maya listened to all of this with the serious, evaluating expression she reserved for things that genuinely required processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Does Vivian know?" she asked. "No, that's the point. I'm going to ask her, and she gets to say yes or no." "She's going to say yes," Maya said, with the calm confidence of someone stating a fact rather than a prediction. "I think so too," he said, "but she gets to say it." Maya considered this. "Will she live here?" "We'd figure that out together." "She should live here," Maya said. "Her house doesn't have Gerald." He looked at his daughter, this small, certain, entirely her own person who had been at the center of his world for 8 years, who had required everything from him and given him back more than he had the vocabulary to describe. "You're okay with this?" he said. Not as a negotiation, just genuinely asking. Maya looked at him with the particular expression she had when she considered an adult slightly behind on something she'd already processed. "Dad," she said,
I like Vivian. I know you do. She came to my school thing. He blinked. Which school thing? The science fair in March. You were at your work thing, and she came and she told everyone about Gerald. Maya said this as though it were fully established history that he should have had access to. She brought a photo of him. He had not known this. He had known Vivian had covered the pickup that day, had known Maya had placed third in the fair with her tree documentation project, had not known Vivian had stood in the gym of an elementary school with a photograph of a tree named Gerald and talked about him to 8-year-olds. He sat on the edge of Maya's bed and felt something move through him that was large and not entirely reducible to words. She didn't tell me that, he said. She said it wasn't a big deal, Maya said, but it was. He nodded slowly. Yeah, it was. He hugged her. She let him for a full 30 seconds before the fidgeting indicated she'd reached capacity, and he stood up and went to the door, and she picked her book back up and then said without looking up, Dad, ask her soon. It's almost the barbecue season. He laughed quietly, alone in the doorway of her room. Yeah, he said, it is. He had known, abstractly, that he wanted it to be the barbecue. The symmetry of it had appealed to him since January, in the quiet way that certain ideas present themselves as correct before they've been fully examined. It had started there, not officially, not in any way that either of them had planned, but actually, practically, the barbecue was where the story had moved from one thing to another. Vivian's thumb on his cheek, the 4 words that had rearranged an entire year. It seemed right that it should come back to that place, that crowd, that particular combination of ordinary people and summer air and the neighborhood that had held both of them separately and then together. He told Vivian nothing. He was not naturally a person who kept things. Not from her, not anymore. The managed distance version of himself had been progressively dismantled over the course of 12 months, and what remained was someone who said the real thing more consistently than he ever had. But he kept this. Not because it required secrecy, but because some things earn their moment, and he was not going to spend the intervening weeks diluting it. She noticed, in the way she always noticed, that something was different. She didn't push. That was one of the things he trusted about her. She had the patience to let things arrive in their own time, which was a quality he'd needed in a partner without having known to look for it. May arrived, then June. The Maplewood Neighborhood Charity Barbecue fell on the second Saturday of August. Same as always, same Riverside Park, same folding tables and community coolers, and Marcus Webb's speaker and the particular sprawling organized chaos of 200 people who'd been in each other's lives long enough to be comfortable in the same space. Landon was at the grill by 9:15. He had asked Carl, the year before, to cover the second hour of his shift. Carl had said why, and Landon had said he needed to step away for something, and Carl had looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man who had been watching the situation develop for a year and had strong suspicions, and then said, "Yeah, all right, I've got it." The ring was in his front pocket. He'd been aware of it since he put on his jeans that morning, a small, constant weight that was both nothing and everything. The barbecue moved through its usual first hours. Children arrived in packs. The Delgado grandchildren colonized the playground equipment. Patrice Okafor's potato salad arrived in the cement mixing bowl because some traditions were non-negotiable. Maya appeared at Landon's elbow at approximately 10, examined the grill operation with the evaluating eye of someone who had been watching this specific process for years, pronounced it adequate, and disappeared into the crowd to find Theo. Vivian arrived at 10:30. She walked across the park in a light blue dress, her hair down, carrying a contribution to the dessert table, and she found him behind the grill and looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for over a year now, directly, warmly, with the ease of someone who was completely used to where they stood. She kissed him on the cheek. She smelled like sunscreen and the particular faint thing he associated with her house in summer. "How's the crowd?" she said. "Hungry? When are you off the grill?" "Carl's covering me at 11. She looked at him for a moment. Something in his face, as ever, was readable to her in ways he still hadn't fully mapped. "Okay," she said, and it had the quality of, "I'm filing that." She didn't push. She went to find Patrice. He watched her go and then looked back at the grill and thought,
with the calm certainty of someone who had been building toward a thing long enough to arrive at peace with it today. 11 o'clock came. Carl appeared with his tongs, the good tongs Landon had briefed him, and took over the grill with the slightly performative competence of someone who wanted credit for this favor. Landon handed off, wiped his hands on the dish towel, scanned the park. He found Vivian near the blanket where she'd been sitting with Patrice and two other neighbors, and he walked over and she looked up at him when he stopped in front of her with the reading expression already running. "Walk with me," he said. She got up. She said something brief to Patrice. He didn't hear it, and she fell into step beside him, and they moved away from the main gathering, toward the outer edge of the park, where the crowd thinned and the noise softened and the large oak tree stood at the edge of the grass, the way it always had, the way it had been standing in that corner of Riverside Park since before anyone on Maplewood Drive had arrived there. Patrice had seen them go. And Carl. And Denise, who had driven down for the barbecue this year, which she had never done before, and who was standing near the beverage table with Ray and was very deliberately not watching them in the way of someone who was watching them extremely carefully. Maya, somewhere in the park, was also not watching, with the focused inattention of someone who had been briefed. Under the oak tree, the noise of the barbecue was a soft background thing, present but not dominant, the sound of the neighborhood going about the business of being itself on a Saturday in August. Vivian stopped beside him under the branches. She looked at him with the full, steady attention she gave to things that mattered. She was not nervous, or if she was holding it the way she held most things, in a way that didn't announce itself. But she was paying attention, all of her attention. "Okay," she said quietly. "What is it?" He looked at her. The woman who had moved to Maplewood Drive 26 months before this moment, chosen a house with an overgrown rose bush, decided that this particular street with its cracked sidewalks and nosy neighbors and very ordinary rhythms was where she wanted to build her actual life, who had shown up, persistently and without ceremony, for a man who hadn't been looking and a child who hadn't asked, and who had done it without agenda, without expectation, without any of the architecture of a person trying to get something back. He thought about what he knew about courage. He had learned it, mostly, from her. Not the dramatic version, not the kind that was performed for an audience in a moment that demanded it. The quiet version. The daily version. The courage it took to say, "I hope they do," in plain daylight with barbecue sauce on your thumb, and mean it completely, and then just walk away and let it be what it was. The courage of saying true things before you were sure they'd be received. The courage of waiting for something real without turning the waiting into bitterness. He had borrowed that version of courage, incrementally, over 12 months. He was using the rest of it now. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what my life looked like before you were in it." She was very still. Not a dramatic before. It wasn't bad. I had Maya, I had the house, I had everything I'd built. But there was a part of it that I had accepted was just going to be empty. Not sad empty, just the kind of empty you stop noticing after a while because you've made peace with it. He paused. "And then you showed up with a casserole and left your name on a note, and I thought, good neighbor. And I just kept thinking that for 2 years, and you just kept being there, and I was so busy not looking at it that I almost—" His voice did something briefly. He let it. "I almost missed it," he said. "I almost missed you." Vivian's eyes were bright. She hadn't looked away. "You wiped barbecue sauce off my face in front of 40 people, and you said 4 words, and I spent the next 14 hours realizing that I had been living next to something I loved without knowing I was allowed to love it." He reached into his pocket. "I'm not good at this part. I've told you that. I'm not good at the grand version. I don't have a speech." "You've been doing fine," she said quietly. "I have one question," he said. He had the ring in his hand. He had not gotten down on one knee. They were standing under the oak tree on the edge of a neighborhood barbecue, and he was not a knee-on-the-ground type of person, and somehow that felt right, felt like them, felt like the honest version of the moment rather than the performed one. He held it out in the plain August light, and he looked at her and he said, "Will you marry me?" The barbecue continued its noise behind them. Somewhere, Marcus Webb's speaker was playing something with a good beat.
Somewhere, Maya was pretending not to watch from behind Theo and was absolutely watching. Denise had her hand over her mouth near the beverage table in the way of someone who had $40 on the line and had also been waiting for this for considerably longer than that. Vivian looked at the ring. She looked at him. She was crying. Not dramatically, not the kind that required management, just two slow tracks down her face that she didn't bother to stop or address, the way you don't bother with things that don't require action. "Obviously, yes," she said. He laughed. It came out of him without permission. Not the polished version, the real one, the one that came from somewhere relieved and warm and entirely certain. "Obviously?" "Obviously." She was laughing too now, through the tears, which was an excellent combination she was carrying with considerably more grace than most people could have managed. "Landon, it has always been obviously yes." He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He had done reconnaissance on this specific point, had borrowed one of her rings from a jewelry dish on her dresser 3 weeks ago while she was in the shower and taken it to the store to have the size confirmed, which was either very practical or slightly unhinged, and he had decided not to examine which. It fit. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. Then she looked up at him and he put his hands on either side of her face. The same gesture, the one he'd come back to again and again over the past year because it was the version that felt most true, most like saying something without words. And he kissed her under the oak tree in the corner of Riverside Park while the neighborhood barbecue continued around them. When he stepped back, he became aware that they had an audience. Not a polite, distant audience. Maplewood Drive was not a polite, distant neighborhood. Patrice Okafor was standing approximately 12 feet away with her hands clasped in an expression of profound personal satisfaction, as though this outcome was something she had personally engineered, which, in the small ways of neighborhoods, was not entirely false. Carl was applauding. Marcus had redirected the speaker. The music had changed to something slower and deliberately romantic, which was the most Marcus Webb gesture possible and somehow entirely right. Denise was crying in the undisguised way of someone who had absolutely earned it, with Ray's arm around her shoulders and $40 presumably no longer in question. And Maya was standing at the edge of the gathering, close enough that she was clearly part of it, far enough that she was maintaining a sliver of personal dignity with Theo beside her. She was watching her father and Vivian with an expression he recognized, the same evaluating look she'd had since she was 4, the one that ran the calculation and then delivered the verdict. He looked at her across the small distance. She looked back. Then she gave him a very small, decisive nod, the kind that meant, yes, good. You got there. He had been getting there, he realized, for longer than the 14 hours after the barbecue sauce incident, longer than the 2 years on Maplewood Drive, longer than he'd understood at the time. He had been, in the accumulating way of a life lived with some attention and some stumbling and the occasional grace of the right person in the right house 3 doors down, getting there for a long time. The rest of the barbecue was what it was, loud and warm and full of the particular noise of people who were happy in the uncomplicated way of a Saturday afternoon in summer, who had just watched one of their own do something true and were standing in it together. Vivian had the ring on her hand, and Patrice looked at it approximately 4 times in the first hour, and each time with the same expression, as though it were new each viewing. Denise hugged Vivian for a long time without saying anything, which, for Denise, was the loudest possible declaration. Ray shook Landon's hand and said, with characteristic efficiency, "Good call." Maya spent most of the afternoon near Vivian in the way she'd been spending time near Vivian for months, the natural orbital pattern of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. At one point, Landon saw them sitting together on the grass near the edge of the park, slightly apart from the crowd, and Vivian was showing Maya something on the ground, a rock or an insect or something else small and worth examining. And Maya was leaning in with the focused attention she gave to things she considered worth her time. He stood with his plate of food and watched them and felt something that did not have a clean name. Not just love, though it was that. Not just gratitude, though it was that too. Something more like recognition. The recognition of having arrived somewhere that had been, without his knowing, the destination all along. He thought about what his life had tried to teach him, across the specific years of it. The lesson had not arrived cleanly or on schedule. It had come in the way lessons come when they are worth learning, sideways, over time, through the accumulation of smaller understandings, through a marriage that ended quietly, through 7 years of building something alone with his hands and his stubbornness and the help of people who loved him, through the daily effort of showing up for a child who needed him to be the constant in a life that had already learned about impermanence. The lesson was not about wealth. He understood this now in a way that was not theoretical. Vivian's money was a fact of her life the way the rosebush was a fact of her life. Present, real, part of who she was, and almost entirely irrelevant to what she had given him. What she had given him was not anything that required a number. It was the daily evidence that someone saw him, the actual version, not the managed one, and chose to stay. That was the thing. That was what all of it amounted to, reduced to its core, being chosen by someone who knew what they were choosing, not chosen out of convenience or proximity or the path of least resistance. Chosen the way Vivian Sterling had chosen, patiently, over 2 years, with the quiet certainty of someone who had done the work of knowing herself well enough to know what she wanted. He had almost not recognized it. That was the part that still sat in him, not with guilt, but with the particular gravity of something almost lost. The things that matter most have a way of arriving quietly, without announcement or packaging, presenting themselves in the ordinary wrapping of daily life. A casserole on a porch, a conversation over a fence, a thumb on your cheek on a Saturday afternoon in August. They don't shout. They show up and they wait for you to look. He had looked. Not as quickly as he should have, not without the push of 4 words that landed on him like a hand on the shoulder, but he had looked. The afternoon moved toward evening. The crowd thinned in the gradual way of summer parties, families peeling off with their folding chairs and leftover food, the children getting the particular glazed look of people who had expended everything available. Marcus Webb packed up the speaker with the satisfied air of someone who considered the musical arc of the afternoon a personal achievement. Patrice Okafor left with the cement mixing bowl and the expression of a woman going home with a story. Landon and Vivian were among the last to leave, helping break down the tables, carrying coolers back to the community shed with the comfortable efficiency of 2 people who had been working beside each other long enough to do it without coordinating. Maya rode on the cart for the last trip back because she had been on her feet for 6 hours and had therefore earned it, and nobody argued with this assessment. Walking home, the 3 of them, through the late August evening that was finally releasing its heat, the sky going the particular orange-pink of late summer sunsets over flat Ohio land, Maplewood Drive was quiet around them. The familiar houses, the cracked sidewalks, the basketball hoop at the end of the Webb's driveway, the rose bush at the front of Vivian's house that had come back again this year, as it had the year before, as it kept coming back. Maya walked between them and held both their hands without making a thing of it, the way she did most important things. Quietly, practically, with the confidence of someone who knew where she was. At the point where the sidewalk split, where Landon's front path went one way and Vivian's went the other, they stopped. Old reflex. The fork in the road they'd been navigating around for over a year. Vivian looked at him. He looked at her. "This is stupid," he said. "It is," she agreed. "You're going to live with us." "I know. We'll figure out the details." "Yes. Maya has a whole case for why you should be on her side of the house." "She mentioned that Gerald is visible from the guest room window," Vivian said. It was a compelling presentation. He looked at her in the evening light, this woman who had turned a house with a rose bush into a home and a neighborhood into a life, who had been patient enough and brave enough to say the true thing before he was ready to say it back, and who was standing on the sidewalk of Maplewood Drive with his ring on her finger and his daughter's hand in hers. "Come home," he said. She looked at him for a moment, the small private smile, the steady, reading eyes. "I've been home," she said, "for a while now." They went inside. The house was what it had always been. The kitchen with the second drawer that still worked fine, and the living room with Maya's rock collection on the windowsill, and the slightly worn couch that had hosted too many movie nights to count, and the back porch where the lawn chair sat correctly level under the evening sky. All of it the same. All of it in the way of things that have been transformed from the inside, entirely different. Maya did not go to bed without negotiation.
because some things do not change. She bargained for 30 extra minutes on the grounds that it was a special occasion, a claim that was both correct and strategically deployed. And Landon gave her 20, and she accepted this with the grace of someone who had gotten most of what she wanted. He heard her, from the kitchen where he and Vivian were washing up the last of the barbecue containers, negotiating with her own thoughts as she settled. A murmur of something that was probably an ongoing internal monologue about the day's events, processed in the unselfconscious way of a child who had not yet learned to keep her inner life fully private. When the house was quiet, they sat on the back porch. The fixed lawn chair and the additional one he'd bought in October when it had become clear that one chair was insufficient for the volume of porch sitting this relationship was going to require. The night was warm and still, the stars where they always were, the fence between their yards where it had always been, already becoming a formality. Vivian had her feet pulled up, the way she sat in cars and on couches and anywhere she was comfortable, and she had his old sweatshirt over the blue dress because the evening had finally remembered it was August turning toward September, and she was looking at the ring on her hand in the low light with an expression he didn't try to read. Just let it be hers. "My mom would have liked you," she said. He looked at her. She didn't say it often. Her mother was a subject that arrived quietly and required quiet back. "Tell me why," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She had a theory about people. She said you could tell what a person was really like by how they treated things that couldn't give them anything back. She looked at the fence. Plants, old neighbors, kids. A pause. "She'd have watched you with Maya for about 10 minutes and she'd have known." He let that sit for a moment. Then, "I would have liked her too." She was difficult, Vivian said, not as a disclaimer, as a fact offered with affection. She had opinions about everything. She would have asked you about 40 questions in the first hour. "I have a sister like that." "I know you do." "I can handle it." Vivian glanced at him sideways. "She would have asked about your 5-year plan." "What's my 5-year plan?" She looked at him. "You're in it," she said simply. The night continued around them, the ordinary August night in the ordinary street, the neighborhood quiet in its late evening way. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. The sprinkler down the block, the one that always ran late, was running. A car went past slowly. He thought, sitting in the back porch dark, about the version of himself that had stood at the grill 12 months ago and made a joke to deflect from a moment that deserved more than deflection. The version that had filed 2 years of evidence under the wrong heading, that had kept a distance he'd told himself was caution and was more honestly fear. The version that sat in parking lots processing bad news alone and told himself that was just how he operated, that the alone part was simply a feature of his particular character. That version had not been wrong exactly. It had just been incomplete. Missing the part about what happened when you stopped maintaining the distance and let the real thing arrive. The real thing was sitting beside him on the back porch in his old sweatshirt with her feet pulled up, and she had said obviously yes in front of half the neighborhood without hesitation. And she had gone to an elementary school science fair in March with a photograph of a tree named Gerald, and she had handed him tape at midnight and made him mediocre pasta and told him the true thing even when the true thing was inconvenient. And she had waited, patiently, without turning the waiting into a weapon, for him to locate his own courage. The most important things in a life did not usually arrive with fanfare. They arrived the way Vivian had arrived on Maplewood Drive, on a Tuesday, with modest boxes, parking a gray SUV in front of a house with an overgrown rosebush. They arrived in the specific, unremarkable packaging of ordinary days, and they required only one thing, that you look. That you stop managing the distance and actually look at what was in front of you, and then, having looked, that you do the harder thing, which was act. He had acted. Late, imperfect, with a fork video and a borrowed level and one very good decision made in the parking lot of a jewelry store on a Saturday morning with his sister beside him. It was enough. Vivian reached over in the dark and took his hand. He held it. The porch was quiet. Inside, Maya was asleep or close to it. The house settled around her in its familiar way. The fence line was still there, technically, the property boundary that had defined the border between their 2 separate lives for 2 years. But borders were just lines on a map. The actual territory had already changed. He looked at the sky and the night and the woman beside him. The most valuable thing in a life was not a number in an account or a title on a door or the kind of success that could be summarized on a single page. It was this: the person beside you at the end of a long day. The one who knew the actual version and had chosen it, specifically and deliberately, over every other available option. The one who was already home.